I've lived in Sundial Mesa, a 55-home passive solar community outside Albuquerque, for 26 years, in a house specifically designed and recorded under a 1998 covenant guaranteeing every south-facing roof unobstructed winter sun. Then, last October, my new neighbor poured a slab for a 2-story RV garage that swallowed my roof's afternoon light whole. And when I called the HOA to enforce the covenant that's protected this whole neighborhood since before I moved in, I was told, cheerfully, that the plans had already been administratively approved. It took me 5 months to find out who'd actually approved them. By the time I did, I understood that my heating bill was the smallest thing this community stood to lose. My name is Adeline Kowalczyk. Everyone in Sundial Mesa just calls me Addie. I'm 61, and I run a small pottery studio out of my converted garage, throwing stoneware I sell mostly at the Saturday market downtown, and to a handful of galleries in Santa Fe. Before that, for 22 years, I worked as a residential solar installer and electrician, which is the actual reason my husband Ray and I bought into this particular neighborhood back in 1999, rather than any of the more conventional developments going up around Albuquerque at the time. Ray passed 4 years ago, quietly, in his sleep, the kind of ending that felt almost unfair given how much noise the man made in life. I've stayed in the house because leaving it never once felt like an option worth taking seriously. Sundial Mesa was built in 1998 by a small regional developer called Zenith Passive Communities, one of a handful of outfits in the late 90s trying to prove that passive solar design could work at real subdivision scale, rather than just as a boutique custom home feature. Every one of the 55 houses here was oriented and engineered around the same core idea: a south-facing wall of thermal mass and glazing, designed to soak up winter sun and hold that heat through the desert nights, cutting heating costs by nearly half compared to a conventional house of the same size. It's the reason our winter gas bills run a third of what my sister pays in her subdivision across town. And it's the reason I fell in love with this particular kind of building science in the first place, 20-some years before I ever expected to be defending it in front of a hearing officer. The developer knew, even in 1998, that passive solar design only works if it's protected from future construction, which is why Zenith recorded something unusually specific for a residential covenant: a solar access protection covenant, attached to all 55 deeds, guaranteeing every lot's south-facing solar aperture a minimum sun angle envelope, essentially a recorded, legally enforceable wedge of open sky running across each neighboring lot to the south, within which no structure could be built above a specified height without a variance reviewed specifically for solar impact. I've known that covenant the way you know a load-bearing wall in your own house: essential, foundational, and something I genuinely never expected to see tested, because in 26 years, nobody in Sundial Mesa had ever built anything tall enough to matter. I've served on the community's architectural review committee for 18 of those 26 years, a volunteer role that mostly involves approving paint colors, xeriscaping plans, and the occasional carport addition, but which also meant I understood this community's governing documents about as well as anybody who isn't a real estate attorney. Our HOA is small and, for most of its history, genuinely low-key. A 5-member volunteer board, modest annual assessments, and until 3 years ago, self-managed entirely by residents rather than any outside management company. That changed 3 years ago, when the board, citing the administrative burden of growing state regulatory requirements around HOA record-keeping, voted to hire an outside management firm called High Desert Community Partners to handle day-to-day administration, architectural review intake, and assessment collection. I remember voting in favor of that decision myself at the time, mostly because I was tired of chasing down late assessment checks in my spare time, and it seemed like a reasonable, unremarkable modernization for a neighborhood that had simply grown too busy to keep running entirely on volunteer goodwill. I remember, too, that the board's vetting process for High Desert amounted to little more than a phone reference from a nearby HOA and a single in-person presentation Voss gave at our clubhouse, in which he spent a good 10 minutes describing the firm's meticulous technical review protocols without ever once naming the solar covenant specifically. At the time, I took his generality as simple unfamiliarity with the fine details of a contract he hadn't yet started administering. I've thought back on that presentation more than once since, wondering whether the vagueness was already, even then, doing exactly the work he needed it to do. Turnover in Sundial Mesa has picked up steadily over the last several years, the same way it has in a lot of the original 90s solar communities around the Southwest, as the founding generation of buyers, people like Ray and me, drawn here specifically for the building science, has aged out and started selling to a newer mix of buyers, some of whom genuinely value the passive solar design, and some of whom, I've come to understand, bought in mostly for the location and the price, without much appreciation for what actually makes these houses work the way they do. My days these days follow a rhythm I've come to genuinely treasure, even 4 years into widowhood. I'm up before 6 most mornings, coffee at the kitchen table, facing that same south-facing thermal wall Ray and I chose this house for, watching the light climb the sandias before I ever opened the studio door. The pottery business started almost by accident, a hobby I picked up after Ray's diagnosis, to keep my hands busy during the long stretches of waiting rooms and bad news. And it's turned, somewhat to my own surprise, into something that pays a real, if modest share of my bills now. I fire 2 kilns a week in the season, glaze on the days in between, and drive into the Saturday market with a hatchback full of stoneware, more Saturdays than not. Our daughter Renata lives in Denver now, with her own family, close enough that she makes the drive down every couple of months, though she still gives me grief about staying in a house this size alone. I tell her the truth, which is that the house doesn't feel too big so much as it feels exactly like the one Ray and I built our whole life around, sun angle calculations and all, and that leaving it would feel less like downsizing than like giving something up I'm not ready to give up yet. Part of what's kept me on the architectural committee this long, if I'm honest, is exactly this shift in who's buying in. Newer residents come to me at least once a season with some version of the same question. Why does the paint palette look the way it does? Why can't they add a second story here? Why does a fence application take 3 weeks instead of 3 days? And I've come to enjoy being the person who can actually explain the reasoning behind a rule, instead of just enforcing it. I like to think that habit of explaining the why behind the covenant, rather than just citing it, is part of what made me notice something was wrong with Marcus's garage well before I understood the scale of what was actually happening. The rest of Sundial Mesa's original design deserves a word too, since it's relevant to understanding just how much was actually at stake once Marcus's garage went up. Beyond the solar envelope covenant itself, Zenith's engineers oriented every street and lot line specifically to maximize each house's southern exposure, meaning the community's entire physical layout, right down to which way the driveways curve, exists in service of the same underlying idea. It's the kind of design detail most residents never think twice about day to day, the way you don't think about a foundation until it cracks. But it's also the reason a single oversized structure in the wrong spot can do so much more damage here than it would in almost any ordinary subdivision. The lot directly south of mine, a modest 3-bedroom that had belonged to a retired school teacher for nearly 20 years, sold last spring to a man named Marcus Thibodeau, who told the few neighbors who introduced themselves that he'd bought the place mainly for the acreage, planning to build a proper garage for the travel trailer and vintage truck he'd hauled in behind a moving van the week he closed. I remember thinking, at the time, that a garage sounded like an entirely reasonable thing for a new neighbor to want, and I didn't give it a second thought through that whole spring and summer while the framing went up. It wasn't until the roof trusses went on in September that I understood exactly what Marcus was building and exactly what it was about to do to my house. What he called a proper garage turned out to be a 2-story structure with a full loft above the vehicle bay, standing a good 11 feet taller than anything the original covenant's solar envelope permitted at that distance from my south wall, positioned in almost the worst possible spot on his lot for my own roof's winter sun angle. I introduced myself to Marcus directly the week the roof went on, mostly out of the same instinct that had made me want to give him the benefit of the doubt all summer. "I don't think we've really met properly," I said. "I'm Addie, right behind you. I have to ask, did the Architectural Review Committee sign off on the height for this? It looks like it might be sitting inside my solar easement envelope." Marcus looked genuinely puzzled by the question, which I took, in the moment, as a good sign rather than a bad one. High Desert approved the plans back in the spring, he said. I submitted everything through their online portal, same as I did for the county permit. Nobody flagged anything about a solar easement. There's a recorded covenant on every lot here, specifically protecting winter sun access for the house to the north, I told him. It's not usually something people build big structures without checking first. Would you mind if I asked High Desert to double-check the file? Sure, go ahead, Marcus said, with the easy confidence of someone who genuinely believed he'd done everything correctly. I paid the review fee and got an approval letter. I don't have any reason to think there's a problem on my end. I want to say something here about why I didn't simply call the county's building inspector that same afternoon and let the matter get resolved through code enforcement alone, since a couple of neighbors suggested exactly that once word started getting around. County building code in this part of New Mexico governs setbacks, structural safety, and general zoning height limits, but it has no mechanism at all for enforcing a subdivision-specific solar access covenant, which exists entirely outside the county's ordinary review and lives or dies on the HOA and its management company actually doing their part. Calling the county would have confirmed the garage met ordinary zoning rules, which it did, and told me nothing at all about the actual problem, which was specific to Sundial Mesa alone. I went back through my own records that evening, the kind of habit I never fully lost from my installer years, and pulled the original 1998 covenant packet Zenith had mailed every buyer at closing, the same packet Ray had filed away in a drawer in his study that I hadn't opened in over 2 decades. Seeing my own younger handwriting in the margins, notes I'd made back when I helped double-check the engineer's solar calculations before we ever broke ground on our own house, brought back a wave of feeling I hadn't expected walking into that conversation with Marcus. Violation. I called High Desert Community Partners office that same afternoon and spoke with an intake coordinator who pulled Marcus's file and confirmed, reading from the record, that the garage plans had received administrative approval the previous April, with no notation of any solar covenant review having been conducted. I asked to speak with whoever had actually reviewed the plans. She told me the review had been handled by the firm's owner directly and that she'd have him call me back. He never called back. I called again 4 days later and was told the owner, a man named Roland Voss, was traveling and would follow up as soon as his schedule allowed. I want to note, because it matters later, that High Desert had handled every architectural submission in this community for 3 years, without a single documented solar covenant review ever showing up in any file I'd personally seen as a member of the architectural committee, which struck me, once I started really thinking about it, as a strange gap for a firm specifically hired to handle exactly this kind of administrative detail. By late October, with the garage's roof fully sheathed and Marcus already moving his RV in and out of the new bay, I woke to find my kitchen a full 4 degrees colder than it should have been for that time of year. According to the little logbook of thermostat readings I've kept out of old habit since Ray and I first moved in, and started tracking how well the passive design actually performed season to season, I checked the sun angle myself that afternoon, the way I would have checked any client's site back when I was still installing panels for a living, and confirmed what I'd already suspected. Marcus's new roofline was casting a shadow across a significant portion of my home's south-facing thermal wall for nearly 3 hours of what should have been my best midday solar gain. I finally reached Roland Voss directly by phone the following week. "I understand you're not happy about a neighbor's garage," he said, in the tone of someone reciting a line he'd used before. "But our review confirmed the structure complies with all applicable county setback and height requirements. I'm not sure what more you're asking us to look at." "The county setback isn't the issue," I said. "There's a recorded solar access protection covenant on both our deeds, specific to this subdivision, that this structure clearly violates. I'd like to know who at your office actually reviewed it against that covenant, because there's no record of that review having happened at all. Our architectural review process covers the standard categories outlined in the governing documents," Voss said, "which I believe primarily concern paint colors, fencing, and general aesthetic consistency. I'd have to check whether a solar-specific technical review is something our scope of work with the board actually includes." I asked Voss one more direct question before ending that call. mostly out of the same instinct that used to make me push back on a client who wanted to skip a load calculation to save on a panel install. Can you tell me whether any solar covenant review was performed on any project you've approved in the last 3 years? I asked. He paused long enough that I understood the answer before he gave it. I'd have to check our files, he said. I don't have that information in front of me right now. I found it strange, and said so, that the owner of a firm this size wouldn't already know the answer to a question about the single review category his own community's governing documents made most distinctive. That answer, a management company hired specifically to handle architectural review, admitting it might not actually be reviewing for the one covenant that makes this entire community's design work in the first place, was the moment I stopped assuming this was a simple oversight. Warning, ignored. I pulled my own copy of the recorded covenant from the county clerk's office the following morning, along with the original 1998 subdivision plat, showing the solar envelope calculations for every lot, documents I'd actually helped Zenith's engineer double-check back when the neighborhood was first built, since I was one of the only buyers at the time who understood the underlying calculations well enough to catch an error. The covenant was exactly as I remembered it, unambiguous, specific, and violated without question by Marcus's new roofline. I sent High Desert a formal written demand the following week, citing the covenant, my own thermostat logbook, and a request for the complete file showing whatever review, if any, had actually been conducted before the plans were approved. I retained a local attorney, a sharp property specialist named Dominic Salerno, mostly to make sure the demand was drafted with enough precision that High Desert couldn't simply wave it off with another vague procedural answer. This is about as clean a covenant violation as I've ever reviewed, Dominic told me during our first meeting, spreading the plat and the covenant across his desk. The sun angle math here is specific and recorded. Either the management company genuinely never checks for this at all, which is a serious failure of the one job they were hired to do, or they checked and approved it anyway. Neither answer is good for them. High Desert's response, 3 weeks later, argued that the covenant's solar envelope language was advisory in nature relative to the county's superseding building code, a position Dominic found almost impressive in its willingness to invent a legal theory with no actual support in either the covenant's text or state law. Recorded covenants aren't advisory just because a management company finds them administratively inconvenient, he told me. This is a stalling position, not a real one. Dominic pulled New Mexico's own case law on recorded covenant enforcement that same week, mostly to make sure our own filing would hold up against exactly this kind of argument, if High Desert tried to escalate it. The state's appellate courts have been consistent for decades that a recorded covenant runs with the land, regardless of whatever a county's general building code separately requires, he told me. The two systems exist side by side on purpose. One doesn't quietly swallow the other, just because it's more convenient for somebody to pretend it does. I found some real comfort in that. The same specific comfort of watching a load calculation check out exactly the way the math said it should. I brought the whole exchange to Marcus directly, catching him at his mailbox one afternoon. High Desert's telling my attorney the solar covenant is basically optional, I told him. I don't think that's going to hold up, and I want you to understand this isn't personal. I just need my house to work the way it was designed to. Marcus's expression shifted in a way that told me he'd started doing some research of his own since our first conversation. Look, Addie, I paid High Desert a rush review fee to get this approved fast, he said. $1,200, on top of the standard fee, because I wanted to get the garage up before winter. Nobody told me there was anything unusual about that. I assumed that's just how this HOA does things. That detail, a rush fee paid specifically to expedite an approval that skipped the one review that actually mattered, was the first piece of information suggesting this was bigger than a single overlooked covenant. I mentioned the rush fee to Bettina Okonkwo over coffee a few days later, mostly just to see whether she'd ever heard of such a thing being offered to anyone else. I don't recall ever seeing an expedited option mentioned anywhere in our management contract, she said, frowning. If High Desert's offering homeowners a paid shortcut around review, that's not a fee schedule I remember the board ever approving. Her reaction told me this wasn't some disclosed, board-sanctioned convenience. It was something happening quietly. off to the side of whatever process the rest of us thought we were paying for. I asked Marcus whether he still had the email confirming the rush fee, mostly out of the same instinct that had sent me digging through Ray's old filing drawer the week before. He forwarded it to me that same evening, and reading it over at my kitchen table, I noticed a detail I might easily have missed if I hadn't already been looking for exactly this kind of thing. The fee was billed not from High Desert's standard invoicing account, listed plainly on every other document I'd ever seen from the firm, but from a slightly different account name, HCP Expedited Services, a distinction subtle enough that I doubt Marcus had ever thought to question it. Dominic laid out two paths forward that winter. The first was a straightforward covenant enforcement action against Marcus directly, seeking either modification or partial removal of the offending structure. The second, slower path involved formally escalating the management company's conduct itself through the state's regulatory oversight of community association managers, which in New Mexico requires firms handling HOA architectural review and assessment collection to maintain proper licensing and documented review procedures. I'd pursue the covenant claim against Marcus first, since that's the fastest way to actually get your sunlight back, Dominic told me. The High Desert question is a slower burn, but if there really is a pattern of skipped reviews tied to rush fees, that's worth surfacing separately, through the state's oversight process, rather than just your own private dispute. We filed the covenant enforcement suit that November, seeking a court order requiring Marcus to modify the garage's roofline to comply with the recorded solar envelope, along with damages for the increased heating costs my logbook documented. Marcus, notably, didn't fight the underlying claim once he understood the covenant's actual force. He brought in his own contractor to assess modification options, genuinely more frustrated with High Desert's approval process than with me personally. Here's the micro setback. Modifying the roofline turned out to require a full re-engineering of the garage's truss system, a process Marcus's contractor estimated would take 4 months once permits and materials were accounted for, meaning I faced most of another winter with a significantly compromised solar gain before any physical fix could actually happen. Dominic negotiated an interim damages arrangement covering my increased gas bills for that period, but the physical problem itself simply couldn't move faster than a full truss re-engineering allowed. I know it's frustrating that fixing this is going to take months rather than weeks, Dominic told me that December, but every bit of this delay is well documented and clearly tied to High Desert's original approval failure, rather than any foot-dragging on Marcus's part. That matters for where this eventually goes with the management company. That whole stretch of winter was harder on me than I let on to Renata during our weekly calls, mostly because it was the first winter since Ray passed that I couldn't simply retreat into the studio and lose myself in glazing when the cold got to me. Every degree the thermostat read low felt like a small, specific insult, a reminder of exactly what this house had been built to do, and exactly how completely somebody else's carelessness had undone it. I fired fewer pieces that season than any winter in years, and more than one evening found me at the kitchen table with Ray's old covenant packet spread out under the lamp instead of at the wheel, where I usually am by that hour. Mini Justice. The court hearing that January was brief, since Marcus's own contractor had already confirmed the covenant violation independently, and the judge ordered the roofline modification completed within the 4-month window Marcus's contractor had proposed, along with the interim damages Dominic had negotiated. Marcus, for his part, seemed almost relieved to have a clear, judicially blessed timeline, rather than an open-ended dispute with a neighbor he genuinely hadn't meant to harm. "I want you to know, I'm not upset with you over any of this," Marcus told me outside the courthouse. "I trusted a process I paid good money to go through correctly. I'm the one who's out a rush fee and a truss redesign because somebody didn't do the one thing I paid them to do. I assumed, walking out of that hearing, that this was substantially the end of it. A covenant enforced, a roofline scheduled for correction, a neighbor dispute resolved without lasting bad blood. I was wrong, and it was Dominic's follow-up records request to High Desert, seeking documentation of every architectural review the firm had conducted involving a rush fee over the prior 3 years, that showed me exactly how wrong. Dominic mentioned the HCP Expedited Services account name I'd noticed on Marcus's invoice during our next meeting, almost as an aside while organizing his file. That's worth pulling on, he said. A separate billing entity for rush fees, distinct from the main management contract, is exactly the kind of structure somebody sets up when they don't want a particular revenue stream showing up in the same place as everything else. I hadn't fully appreciated, until he said it plainly, how much that one small invoicing detail was about to matter. The records High Desert was eventually compelled to produce showed that Marcus's garage wasn't an isolated lapse. 6 other lots across Sundial Mesa had paid an identical rush review fee over the previous 2 years, and every single one of those approvals had gone through, with no documented solar covenant review on file, exactly like Marcus's. Every one of those 6 lots, once Dominic cross-referenced the county's own property records, had also changed ownership within months of the rushed approval. Sold, in each case, to a buyer connected to the same small group of shell companies. Dominic pulled the corporate filings behind those 6 buyer entities the same week, and what he found reframed the entire situation. The 6 shell companies all traced back to a single holding entity called Mesa Vista Capital, registered to an address in Santa Fe, which had spent roughly 2 years quietly acquiring lots throughout Sundial Mesa, always immediately after securing a rushed architectural approval that happened to skip the solar covenant review, always reselling the improved properties within a year, at a substantial markup once the new construction was complete. Look at the timeline here, Dominic told me, spreading the corporate records across his desk. Every one of these 6 lots got bought at a below-market price by a distressed or absentee owner, rushed through architectural approval with the one review skipped that would have caught a problem, built out fast, and flipped for a healthy profit within 12 months. That's not 6 unrelated coincidences. That's a business model, and it required somebody inside High Desert cooperating every single time. I drove out to Marcus's place that same week, mostly to let him know what Dominic had found, since his own rushed approval had turned out to be part of the exact same pattern, even though his purchase hadn't come through Mesa Vista. I bought straight from the prior owner, no flip involved, he told me. But now that you mention it, my real estate agent did mention High Desert's rush review as basically routine, like she'd steered other buyers through the exact same process before. I didn't think anything of it at the time. That detail, a real estate agent apparently familiar enough with High Desert's rush process to recommend it as routine, turned out to matter more than either of us understood standing in his driveway that afternoon. Dominic pulled the HCP Expedited Services billing entity's own registration the following week, and it turned out to be registered to the same Santa Fe address as Mesa Vista Capital, filed only 4 months apart, with an overlapping registered agent. This is the piece that ties the rush fees directly to the flip operation, rather than just sitting next to it, Dominic told me. Every one of those 6 rush fees didn't just fund an incomplete review. It funded the exact mechanism that made each flip possible, collected by an entity sharing an address with the company doing the flipping. Roland Voss had run High Desert Community Partners for 11 years, managing a modest portfolio of small HOAs across the Albuquerque metro area, with a professional reputation that, until this, I genuinely never heard questioned. Nobody in 3 years of managing Sundial Mesa had ever needed to ask what happened when a management company hired specifically to protect a community's recorded covenants started quietly profiting from ignoring the one covenant that mattered most. I want to answer plainly why Voss believed he could run this pattern across 6 separate properties without anyone noticing. The honest answer is that architectural review, for all its formal language in governing documents, ultimately depends on homeowners trusting that a hired management company is actually doing the specific technical work it's paid to do, and Sundial Mesa, like a lot of small HOAs that outsource this kind of review, had never had a reason to audit that trust closely before a pattern this coordinated came along. Dominic discovered, through a routine business registration search, that Voss himself held a minority ownership stake in Mesa Vista Capital, structured through a family trust that didn't bear his own name directly on the state's business filings, but that traced back to him through a shared registered agent address he'd used for both High Desert and his personal real estate holdings for over a decade. I called a former client of High Desert's I knew through the Albuquerque solar installers circle, a retired property manager named Sylvia Marchetti, who'd worked with Voss briefly a decade earlier on a different subdivision's board before that HOA switched management firms. Roland was always good with people, Good at the presentation side of the job, she told me over the phone, after I explained why I was asking. But even back then, I remember a couple of us on that other board wondering how his numbers on assessment reserve accounts always seemed to work out just a little too cleanly in his favor. Nothing anyone ever proved. Just a feeling that stuck with me longer than it probably should have. Hearing that, a full decade removed from whatever had happened on that other board, was the first sign I had that Sundial Mesa might not be the only community that had ever had reason to wonder about him. Violation. The full financial picture, once Dominic filed a broader records request covering both High Desert's rush fee billing records and Mesa Vista's property acquisition and resale filings, was considerably worse than 6 skipped reviews. Mesa Vista had netted just over $800,000 in combined profit across the 6 flipped lots over 2 years, and Voss's ownership stake entitled him to a defined percentage of each sale's profit, on top of the rush fees his own management company had separately collected for approving the very construction that made each flip profitable. This is the same shape as most of these schemes once you've seen a few of them, Dominic told me, laying the acquisition dates next to the rush fee billing records on his office table. A person with real authority over an approval process profits, quietly, from the exact outcome that approval produces, structured just vaguely enough that any single transaction looks defensible in isolation. It's the pattern across all 6 that makes the intent unmistakable. I want to be honest that I didn't fully appreciate, until Dominic walked me through it, how much this scheme had actually cost the broader community, beyond my own compromised solar gain. Every one of the 6 flipped lots had been resold to new buyers with disclosure paperwork that never once mentioned the skipped covenant review, meaning at least a few of those new owners were themselves now living behind construction that might, in time, violate someone else's solar envelope, the same way Marcus's garage had violated mine, without any of them knowing to check. I spent a weekend that spring driving the loop through Sundial Mesa slowly, comparing each of the 6 flipped addresses against the original 1998 Platts sun angle diagrams, the same diagrams I'd helped double-check as a much younger woman standing in Zenith's site office, with Ray still very much alive beside me. 2 of the 6, even from the street, looked like they were pushing hard against the edge of what their lot's envelope should have allowed. I didn't have the authority to confirm anything without a proper survey, but the shape of the pattern was becoming harder to unsee with every address I checked off my list. Dominic pulled one more thread that reframed things again. High Desert's original management contract with our HOA board, which he obtained through the same records request, explicitly required the firm to maintain documented technical review of all covenant-specific approval categories, including the solar envelope, a contractual obligation Voss's firm had simply never honored for any of the 6 flipped properties. Whoever negotiated this contract assumed the management company would actually do what it was hired to do, Dominic said. That assumption held for years. It just didn't hold here. I sat with the full acquisition and rush fee spreadsheet alone one evening before bringing it to the rest of the board, mostly because I wanted to be sure of what I was actually looking at before asking 4 other volunteers to trust my read on it. 6 lots, 6 rush fees, 6 skipped reviews, 6 flips, all routed through 2 entities sharing the same Santa Fe address. Renata called that same night for our usual weekly check-in and found me still at the table with the spreadsheet spread out, and she sat quietly on the phone while I talked her through it, the way I used to talk Ray through a tricky glaze formula, thinking out loud until the shape of the thing became clear to both of us at once. I brought the acquisition pattern and Voss's ownership stake to our HOA's 4 other board members directly, all of whom, to their credit, seemed genuinely unaware of any connection between High Desert and Mesa Vista. We hired High Desert specifically because they came recommended as thorough on technical review. One longtime board member, a retired hydrologist named Bettina Okonkwo, told me, visibly rattled. I signed off on renewing their contract twice, without ever once auditing an actual review file. I see now why that oversight was more convenient for somebody than I realized. I requested High Desert's contract be terminated directly at our next board meeting, laying out the shell company pattern and Voss's ownership stake in front of a room that included several of the affected homeowners. including 2 of the newer buyers who'd unknowingly purchased Mesa Vista flips. Every fee High Desert has ever charged has been fully disclosed within our standard billing practices, Voss said, when the board invited him to respond. My personal investments are entirely separate from my management company's professional obligations. I don't believe there's any actual conflict here that violates our contract. You've been paid twice on the same 6 properties, Bettina said. Once by your management company for approving construction that skipped a required review, and once through your ownership stake in the company that profited from exactly what that skipped review allowed. That's not 2 separate business interests running in parallel. That's the same scheme wearing 2 hats. A third board member, a semi-retired contractor named Owen Vasquez, who'd built a couple of the original Sundial Mesa homes back in Zenith's day, asked the question that seemed to land hardest in that room. Roland, did you personally sign off on any of these 6 approvals yourself? Or did somebody on your staff handle them without knowing what you knew? Voss's answer was a long pause, followed by an admission that he had, in fact, personally reviewed and approved all 6 himself, a detail that undercut whatever thin defense he might otherwise have offered about staff error or oversight failure further down his organization. Dominic laid out 2 paths forward, both running through state rather than purely local channels. New Mexico's Regulation and Licensing Department oversees community association manager licensing and can investigate and discipline firms for documented breaches of their contractual and fiduciary obligations to the communities they serve. Separately, the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division maintains authority to investigate deceptive trade practices affecting consumers, which a pattern of concealed conflicts of interest in HOA management arguably qualifies as. I'd file both complaints together, Dominic told me. The licensing board can address whether Voss should keep managing any HOA at all. The Attorney General's office can address the broader deceptive pattern affecting every homeowner who unknowingly bought one of these flipped lots. We filed the licensing complaint that spring, attaching the acquisition timeline, the rush fee billing records, and Voss's ownership documentation. We filed the separate Consumer Protection Division complaint the same week, naming both High Desert and Mesa Vista Capital. Here's the micro setback. Voss's attorney responded to both filings by arguing that his ownership stake, structured through a family trust, was legally distinct from his management company's operations and therefore couldn't constitute an actual conflict of interest under state HOA management regulations, a technical argument that threatened to stall both investigations for months while the agencies sorted out the corporate structure question. This kind of structural argument sometimes buys real delay, Dominic told me. But it rarely survives once an investigator actually traces the money rather than just the paperwork. Bettina brought a second concern to the board that same week, one that hadn't fully occurred to me until she raised it. If Voss anticipates this investigation dragging on, she said, there's nothing stopping him from continuing to manage other HOAs across the metro area in the meantime, potentially running the exact same rush fee pattern somewhere else, while ours gets sorted out. Dominic agreed the concern was legitimate and added a request to both filings asking the state to consider an interim suspension of Voss's active management contracts pending the outcome of the investigation, rather than waiting for a final resolution that might take the better part of a year. Climax. That spring stretched longer than I'd hoped, largely because both state agencies moved at the deliberate pace bureaucracies generally do, and more than one evening found me at my kitchen table with Dominic's case binder, wondering whether the whole effort would simply get lost in a jurisdictional argument about trust structures. The turning point came when a state licensing investigator, working through Mesa Vista's bank records directly, rather than relying on Voss's corporate paperwork, traced the exact percentage split from each of the 6 sales landing in an account tied to Voss's personal address, regardless of which trust name appeared on the formal ownership documents. The interim suspension request, notably, was granted within 3 weeks rather than dragging through the full investigation timeline, and the state licensing office quietly notified 2 other small HOAs under High Desert's management that their architectural review files were being audited as a precaution. Neither of those 2 communities turned out to have Mesa Vista-linked flips of their own, which Dominic took as some reassurance that the scheme had stayed contained to Sundial Mesa specifically, likely because our subdivision's unusually strict solar covenant made the skipped review trick uniquely profitable here, in a way it wouldn't have been in a more ordinary neighborhood. Bettina Okonkwo called a special board meeting that summer to formally terminate High Desert's contract, a meeting that drew a larger turnout than any HOA meeting I could remember in 26 years, including several of the newer homeowners who'd bought Mesa Vista flips and were only now understanding what had actually happened to the properties they'd purchased in good faith. One of those newer owners, a young engineer named Priya Deshmukh who'd bought one of the flipped lots the year before, stood up during public comment and said something that landed harder in that room than almost anything Dominic or I had said all spring. "I bought my house because I loved the idea of passive solar living," she said. "I had no idea the very company that approved my own home's modifications might have been skipping the review that protects my neighbor's sunlight too. I want to know my house isn't quietly costing somebody else their winter heat the way this cost Addie hers." Marcus, who'd finished his own truss modification by then, spoke next, addressing the room rather than the board directly. "I paid High Desert to do a job correctly, and they didn't," he said. "I don't think that's a small thing to just let go because untangling it is inconvenient." The board voted unanimously that evening to terminate High Desert's management contract effective immediately, and to hire an independent, outside-audited replacement firm with no ownership ties to anyone doing business within the community. Owen Vasquez, who'd stayed quiet through most of the meeting after his one pointed question, spoke again near the end, addressing the newer homeowners in the room rather than the board. "Some of you weren't here when Zenith built this place," he said. "I was one of the crews that framed the first 15 houses. We took the solar calculations seriously because the developer made us, and because it actually mattered to how these houses perform. I'd hate for anybody living here now to think that mattered less than it used to, just because somebody found a way to profit off cutting the corner." Mini Justice. The State Regulation and Licensing Department's investigation, concluding that same autumn, suspended Voss's Community Association manager license for 18 months and imposed a substantial civil penalty for the documented pattern of concealed conflicts of interest. The Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, in a parallel settlement, required Mesa Vista Capital to fund an independent solar covenant compliance audit of all 6 previously flipped properties, at the company's own expense, with any further violations subject to mandatory correction. 2 of the 6 audited properties were found to carry additional, previously undetected covenant violations beyond Marcus's garage, both since scheduled for correction under the settlement's terms. Priya Deshmukh's own lot, to her considerable relief, was cleared entirely. I called Sylvia Marchetti back once the settlement was final, mostly because I felt she deserved to know that the feeling she'd carried for a decade about those old assessment numbers had turned out to belong to a much larger pattern than either of us understood at the time. "I won't pretend that makes up for whatever happened on our old board years ago," she told me. "But I'm glad somebody finally had the paperwork to prove what a few of us only ever had a hunch about." I've thought about that phone call more than once since, how long a quiet, unprovable suspicion can sit with a person, waiting for someone else, somewhere else, to finally have the documents to back it up. The civil penalty itself, once finalized, came to just under $200,000, split between the state's general fund and a portion earmarked specifically for a newly created homeowner education program on covenant enforcement rights. Something Dominic told me was almost unheard of for a settlement this size. Usually these penalties just disappear into a general fund, and nobody outside the agency ever hears about them again, he said. Getting a real portion earmarked for actually teaching homeowners their rights is the kind of outcome that might genuinely help the next person who finds themselves in your position, somewhere else in the state, years from now. Owen Vasquez volunteered to personally inspect the 2 remaining violation properties alongside the settlement's independent auditor, given his own history building the original homes, and both owners, once they understood what had actually happened to their purchases, cooperated fully with the correction timeline, rather than treating it as an adversarial process. Neither of them had any idea, Owen told me afterward. They just wanted a nice house near Albuquerque. They got caught in something they never had any part in causing. People sometimes ask whether one neighbor's oversized garage was really connected to an $800,000 flipping scheme, or whether I simply got lucky pulling at a loose thread. I don't think it was luck, and I don't think the two things were ever as separate as they first looked. Both depended on the same quiet bet, that a small community of solar enthusiasts and retirees wouldn't have the patience or the technical background to notice when the one review protecting their entire design got quietly skipped. The question underneath all of it was never really about one blocked roofline. It was about whether Sundial Mesa could trust that the covenant making this whole community work as designed was actually being protected, or whether that protection would get quietly sold off, one rushed approval at a time, by whoever figured out how to profit from skipping it. Renata asked me, on one of her visits down from Denver not long after the settlement, whether I regretted spending the better part of a year on a fight that started with a single blocked roofline, instead of just accepting the interim damages and letting the rest go. I told her the honest truth. No, though I hadn't expected, at 61, to spend a year of my widowhood reading corporate filings and rush fee invoices, instead of just glazing pots and watching the light climb the mountains, the way Ray and I always did together. She told me that sounded exactly like something her father would have found a way to be proud of, which is about as good a thing as anyone's said to me since he passed. I think about Roland Voss more than I expected to, honestly, in the months since this resolved. 11 years is a long time to manage small communities honestly, before a pattern like this takes hold. I don't think he set out, on day one, planning anything like what it eventually became. I suspect the first skipped review, for a single well-connected buyer, felt like an ordinary professional favor, and each subsequent one simply got easier to justify than admitting the first one had crossed a line. I don't offer that as an excuse. I offer it because it's a more useful lesson than simply calling him greedy and moving on. Since the version of this story, where somebody sets out from day one to defraud an entire neighborhood, is rarer than the version where somebody drifts into it, one convenient shortcut at a time. My kitchen gets its full winter sun back this year, for the first time since Marcus broke ground, and I've taken to sitting at that south window most mornings with my coffee, the way Ray and I always did, just to confirm it for myself. Marcus stops by every so often now, mostly to compare notes on how his modified roofline is holding up, and I don't hold any of this against him. He was as much a customer failed by high desert as I was a neighbor harmed by it. Priya Deshmukh joined the Architectural Review Committee with me this year, the first new volunteer we've had in nearly a decade, and she's brought a genuinely useful engineer's eye to reviewing solar envelope calculations that I'd been carrying almost entirely alone for years. Bettina Okonkwo pushed through a permanent rule requiring any future management company's architectural review files to be spot audited annually by an independent third party. A safeguard I wish this community had thought to require a long time before it ever became necessary. Owen Vasquez has taken to giving informal talks at our general meetings a couple times a year now, walking newer residents through the actual building science behind the solar envelope covenant, the way Zenith's original crews understood it, since he says half the disputes a community like ours ever runs into start with somebody simply not understanding why a rule exists in the first place. I sat in on the first one myself, notebook in hand out of old habit, and found myself just as absorbed as any of the newcomers, hearing him explain calculations I'd known cold for over 2 decades, but had never once heard laid out in quite that plain, patient way. The new management firm Sundial Mesa hired, a considerably smaller outfit run by a husband and wife team out of Rio Rancho, has kept every architectural review file open to any resident who asks. A policy so simple, I sometimes wonder why it took a scandal this size to make it standard practice here. I've stopped by their office twice now, just to see a file for myself. Not because I doubted anything, but because I've found I like the reassurance of checking now and then, the same way I used to walk a finished install site once more after the crew packed up, just to be sure. I got a call last month from a homeowner in a different solar subdivision, clear on the other side of Albuquerque. A woman named Constance Achebe, who'd found my name through the state licensing case file and wanted to know how I'd gone about proving the sun angle math held up in court. I spent the better part of an hour on the phone with her, walking through the same calculations Zenith's engineer had taught me decades ago, the same ones I'd used to check Marcus's roofline the first afternoon I understood what his garage had actually done. It struck me, hanging up that call, that this was probably closer to the actual point of all of it than any settlement figure or license suspension. One more homeowner somewhere else in this state, now knowing exactly what to check and exactly how to ask for it, before her own community's covenant got quietly sold out from under her, the same way mine nearly was. I didn't do any of this out of anger at Marcus, or even really at Roland Voss, though I won't pretend the scale of what he was willing to risk for a percentage of 6 house flips doesn't still trouble me when I think about it. I did it because that solar covenant was recorded in 1998 by a developer who believed this community was worth building around real building science, and because Bettina and Priya and Marcus and a room full of strangers were willing, once somebody showed them what was actually happening, to stand up and say it mattered. Turns out that's most of what keeping a solar community's promise intact actually requires. Somebody willing to keep asking for the paperwork, and enough neighbors willing, when it matters, to show up and read it. This video is a dramatized storytelling narrative based on real-life themes and property, HOA, and consumer protection regulations. Names, characters, and specific locations are fictional or have been changed for privacy. Visuals are generated using AI tools for illustrative purposes only. This content is for entertainment purposes and does not constitute legal advice. If your HOA's management company approved a neighbor's construction a little faster than seemed normal, would you know how to check whether the review that mattered most ever actually happened? I went on a 2-week vacation to Portugal in early October. Left my ridgeline property exactly as it had been for 17 years. Mature hardwoods along the back elevation, oaks and hickories and maples that took decades to grow into what they were. 60-year-old trees, the kind of canopy you can't replace in a lifetime. When I landed back home on a Thursday afternoon and drove up the county road, I could see from my driveway what had happened before I'd even gotten out of the car. 23 stumps, fresh cut, and through the gap where the tree line had been, I could see straight through to the neighboring property's back deck, and the man standing on it, coffee in hand, admiring what I later learned to call his improved view. My property on Ridgecrest Road sits on the eastern edge of a semi-rural subdivision outside Clearwater Township. 2 acres total, about 3/4 of an acre cleared and developed around the house and the small outbuildings, and the remaining 1.25 acres running up along the back ridge in mature hardwood forest. The ridge itself is the defining feature of my property. It rises about 30 feet above the cleared area, covered in trees that were established well before I was born. When I bought the property in 2006, the realtor described the ridge as a natural privacy screen and a wildlife corridor. That sounded like realtor language at the time. 17 years later, I understood exactly what she meant. The ridge canopy blocked the prevailing western wind in winter, gave the property a natural, private feeling from the backyard, and hosted everything from white-tailed deer to a pair of red-tailed hawks that nested in a large oak near the crest every spring. I hadn't done anything particularly commercial with those trees. I'd had an arborist assess them in 2018, just to understand what I had, and he'd noted several specimens worth significant lumber value if I ever decided to harvest. 3 large hickories, each with 18 to 20-inch trunk diameter, and a stand of red oaks along the crest that he called exceptional for their age and straightness. I'd kept his report in a drawer and done nothing with it. I wasn't ready to take those trees down. I liked them there. My neighbor to the east, Philip Crane, bought the adjacent property about 3 years before this happened. He'd renovated it extensively. New siding, a large back deck, some professional landscaping on the cleared portions. Nice work, genuinely. He seemed to take pride in the property. The issue, as I came to understand it later, was the view. From Philip's back deck, the western horizon, a broad valley view that would have been genuinely spectacular, was partially blocked by the hardwood canopy along my back ridge. Not completely blocked, you could see the sky and some of the valley from certain angles, but the full panoramic was cut off by my trees. Philip had mentioned this to me once, about a year after he moved in. Casual, over-the-fence kind of comment. If you ever thought about thinning out those trees back on the ridge, I'd love to see the view open up. I'd said something non-committal about maybe doing it someday, but not having plans at the moment. He'd nodded, and that was the end of it. I should have been clearer, but I had no reason to think clarity was necessary. The trees were on my property. The idea that he might act without my permission didn't occur to me. My neighbor across the road, Helen, texted me on October 9th while I was in Lisbon. The text said, "Did you hire tree people? There's a crew back on your ridge." She added a second message. "Should I say something to them?" I called her immediately. She described a crew of 4 or 5 men with chainsaws, a wood chipper, and a pickup truck with a trailer, working on my back ridge. She said she'd seen them arrive around 8 in the morning and had assumed, at first, that I'd hired them before I left. I asked her to take photos and send them. Then I started trying to reach the county sheriff's non-emergency line, which took 3 attempts to get through to a live person. The deputy I spoke to said that without evidence, the crew was working without authorization, and without a way to confirm whose property they were on, there wasn't much they could do remotely. He suggested I contact the contractor directly or have a neighbor approach them. Helen went over and spoke to the crew foreman. He told her they'd been hired to clear view corridor obstruction on a property on Ridgecrest Road, that the homeowner had arranged it, and that they had a work order. Helen asked if she could see the work order. The foreman showed her a document with Philip Crane's address and name on it, listing the site of work as my address. That's when she texted me again. "The work order is in Philip's name, but has your address as the work site. This doesn't seem right." I told her she was correct, that it didn't seem right. I told her to take as many photos as she could. She sent me 18 photographs over the next 2 hours. I landed back in the US on a Thursday afternoon, 2 days later. I didn't go home first. I drove directly from the airport to Ridgecrest Road. I parked in my driveway, walked through the house, and went out the back. 23 stumps, still fresh, the wood pale at the center, sawdust still visible in the grass around each one. I walked the ridge, counting. 11 red oaks, 7 hickories, 4 sugar maples, 1 large tulip poplar that had been the tallest tree on the property, visible from the road, all of them with trunk diameters greater than 18 inches. All of them, and I would have Philip's work order to confirm this later, specifically selected because they were the trees obstructing the view from his deck. I could see his deck clearly from where I stood on my ridge, open sightline to the western valley. Exactly what the view would look like if my trees hadn't been there. I took my own photographs. I measured and photographed every stump. Then I drove to the county arborist's office and left a voicemail asking for an urgent assessment. The arborist came out 2 days later. I paid $350 for the assessment and report. He documented each tree, species, estimated age, trunk diameter, and replacement value calculated using the Council of Tree and Landscape Appraisers formula, which is the standard method for valuing removed trees in timber trespass cases. His report covered all 23 trees. Total replacement value, $31,400. Then I went to Philip's door. I'll give Philip credit for one thing. He answered the door and didn't pretend not to know why I was there. He looked like a man who'd known this conversation was coming and had prepared his opening position. "Those trees were blocking the view corridor," he said, before I'd said more than 2 words. "I did some research, and there's no local ordinance in unincorporated Clearwater Township against removing trees. I looked it up." He was right about the ordinance. Clearwater Township doesn't have a tree preservation ordinance. In unincorporated rural areas, tree removal regulations are minimal. He'd done his homework on that specific point. What he hadn't done was look up the law on cutting down trees that belonged to someone else. I told him the ordinance question was irrelevant. The trees were on my property. He'd hired a crew to cut them down without my knowledge or permission. That wasn't a zoning question. That was timber trespass, a specific civil cause of action under our state's property statutes. He said, "I had a survey done. I was told the ridgeline was unclear." I asked who did the survey. He said it was a contractor friend who'd walked the property and identified the general ridgeline. Not a licensed surveyor, not a registered plat review, a contractor friend who'd walked the property. I told him the county GIS parcel map, which I showed him on my phone, pulled up on the county's public records site, showed every one of those stumps on my parcel. The legal boundary didn't follow the ridge crest. It followed the recorded plat from 1962, when this area was subdivided. His property ended 30 feet east of the ridge crest. Every tree he'd taken was 30 feet or more west of that boundary. He looked at my phone screen. He looked at the stumps through the gap that used to be the canopy. He said, "What's done is done. They were just trees. How much do you want?" Just trees. I thought about that phrase for a long time afterward. 23 specimens, the oldest of them probably planted during the Kennedy administration, taken down in a single morning because one person decided the view was worth more than what stood in the way. Just trees. I told him I'd had a professional arborist assess the removal, and that the replacement value was $31,400. I told him I was willing to pursue a direct settlement before involving attorneys or courts, if he was willing to engage seriously. He said, "That number is insane. I'm not paying that." I told him I'd give him 2 weeks to consult with an attorney before we proceeded further. I was being generous with the timeline, and I knew it. He said, "I'll talk to my attorney, but I'm telling you right now, that number is not happening." I said, "I hear you. Talk to your attorney. 2 weeks." And I walked back to my truck and drove home. The 2 weeks were a courtesy. I was already thinking about what came after. Timber trespass is a recognized cause of action in most states, and ours is no exception. The basic framework: when someone cuts, removes, or destroys timber on another person's property without permission, the property owner is entitled to recover the value of the timber taken. In cases of willful trespass, where the trespasser knew or should have known the timber was on someone else's property, many states allow treble damages, up to 3 times the fair market value of the timber removed. My attorney reviewed the situation within a week of the trees being cut. She was a property rights attorney with experience in timber trespass cases, and when I laid out the evidence, the arborist report, Helen's photographs, Philip's own admission that he'd arranged the crew, the GIS parcel map, she said the case was strong. The question was whether to characterize it as willful trespass, which would support the treble damages argument, or simple negligent trespass, which would recover the $31,400 replacement value without the multiplier. Her recommendation: file for willful trespass. Philip had specifically asked his contractor friend to survey the boundary, which showed he was aware there was a boundary question. He'd proceeded anyway with a crew that cut 30-plus trees without a licensed survey to confirm the boundary. That's willful in the legal sense. Not, I meant to do harm, but I knew there was a question, and I proceeded without resolving it. We filed a civil complaint for timber trespass in the amount of $31,400, with a notice of intent to pursue treble damages given the willful characterization, which would bring the potential recovery to $94,200. Philip received service of the complaint 14 days after our conversation at his door. His attorney contacted my attorney 3 days later and asked for a settlement conference. Good. That was the response I was hoping for. Courts are expensive and slow. A settlement conference is faster and produces a binding resolution. Meanwhile, I pursued 2 parallel tracks. The crew Philip had hired was not a licensed tree service. I confirmed this by looking up the State Contractor Licensing Board's public database. You can search by company name and license type. The company name on the work order Helen had photographed wasn't in the database. An unlicensed contractor performing tree removal on residential property violates the state's contractor licensing statutes, which I reported to the licensing board with the work order photograph as evidence. This wasn't about punishing the workers. It was about creating a formal record that Philip had engaged an unlicensed operator to perform work on property he didn't own. That matters in a trespass case because it compounds the willfulness argument. He'd gone with the cheaper, unlicensed option, which also happened to be the option that didn't require him to show permits or surveys. Regardless of the civil case, Philip's crew had entered my property without my permission. That's criminal trespass. I filed a report with the county sheriff's office. The sheriff didn't make an arrest. That's normal in property dispute situations without a physical altercation. What they did do was issue Philip a criminal trespass warning, a formal document on file with the sheriff's office, giving him notice that he had accessed my property without permission and was prohibited from doing so in the future, and open a case file. That file would be referenced if anything else happened on my property involving Philip. The criminal trespass record, the contractor licensing complaint, and the civil lawsuit together presented Philip's attorney with an uncomfortable picture. The conference was scheduled 5 weeks after we filed. By that point, Philip's attorney had presumably told him the same things mine had told me. The case was strong, the willful trespass characterization was defensible, and treble damages were a real exposure. Going to trial risked a judgment of $94,200, plus my attorney fees, plus his own attorney fees. Settling for something close to the base, $31,400 was the rational choice. His attorney opened at $12,000. My attorney responded with $38,000. The base value plus attorney fees incurred to that point. We went back and forth twice. The final number, $31,000. Just under the full arborist valuation. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue the treble damages, and I agreed to withdraw the civil complaint. The criminal trespass warning stays on file regardless. I had no authority to withdraw that. The contractor licensing board complaint was already in their queue. Philip paid the $31,000 settlement in a single payment, 42 days after the conference. My attorney received the wire transfer and confirmed it cleared. I've already consulted with a reforestation specialist about the ridge. She told me what I already suspected. You can't replace a 60-year-old tree. You can plant a 60-year-old tree's offspring, and in 60 years, if things go well, you'll have something comparable. She recommended a mix of 41 native hardwood saplings, red oaks, shagbark hickory, sugar maple, planted at appropriate spacing for canopy development. The planting cost, including site preparation and a 3-year maintenance plan to ensure establishment, about $8,400. I wrote that check without hesitation. The remaining $22,600 of the settlement went into a property maintenance fund. The saplings went in last November, 41 of them, on the ridge, evenly spaced. Tiny things right now, 4 to 6 feet tall, staked against deer browse, wrapped at the base. They look almost comically small against the sky. In 10 years, they'll be real trees. In 20, they'll be a canopy. In 40, they'll look the way my ridge looked before October of last year. Philip's house sold 8 months after the settlement. I don't know the circumstances. People sell houses for all kinds of reasons. The new owners seem nice. They wave when they see me, and their kids play in the backyard near the fence line, without any apparent awareness of what happened there. Philip's view of the Western Valley, from that back deck where he stood with his coffee that October morning, it's going to narrow, year by year, as the saplings grow. Not because I planned it, just because that's how forests work. You cut them, and then they come back. Slowly, patiently, inevitably. 23 stumps, 41 saplings. Time works in one direction and doesn't ask permission. I didn't want $31,000. I wanted my trees. But since the trees were gone and the money was there, I took the money and planted new ones. Seemed like the right thing to do. He wanted a view. I let the law deliver the verdict, and planted the next generation on the ridge anyway. Has anyone ever done something to your property while you were away and assumed you wouldn't notice or wouldn't fight back? What happened when you found out? Tell me below.